The Empire had planned it all meticulously. 60,000 lives, bound and shackled, would be extinguished in a single, chilling broadcast. The world would watch as these so-called rebels, who had dared to rise against the might of the Galactic Empire, were made an example of. The event was not merely an execution, it was an exhibition of absolute control, a message broadcast to every corner of the galaxy: resist, and this is your fate. The rebels stood, lined up in rows, their faces gaunt and weary from days of confinement. There were humans among them, but the majority came from dozens of other species, each one subjugated in their own way by the Empire's tyranny. They wore expressions of defiance, but it was a defiance born of desperation, knowing that resistance would be meaningless now. The Imperial announcer's voice boomed across the facility, promising justice, promising order. But to the prisoners, it was nothing more than a death sentence wrapped in propaganda. The arena was massive, a sprawling monument to the Empire's efficiency. A giant screen projected the faces of the rebels, zooming in to capture every moment of their humiliation. The prisoners' families, their friends, their fellow citizens, no one would be spared from witnessing this brutal spectacle. This was the Empire's way of ensuring that any flicker of rebellion, any flicker of hope, would be snuffed out. Standing in the shadows, the Imperial officials observed the proceedings with an air of detached satisfaction. These men and women, creatures of alien races who had been conditioned by their own people to see such violence as just, held no remorse. To them, these executions were simply business. There was no joy, no guilt, just a cold, calculated performance. Their eyes flicked from the screen to one another, exchanging brief nods of approval as the final preparations were made. They had made their point. They would crush the spirit of anyone who dared defy their rule. But in the crowd watching from every corner of the galaxy, there were those who were beginning to understand the true nature of the Empire. People were growing tired of the endless brutality, the endless suffering. And it was not just the rebels who were beginning to feel the weight of oppression. The ordinary citizens of the galaxy were becoming more and more disillusioned by the Empire's demands, their control over every aspect of life, their constant manipulation. For the first time in years, whispers of resistance began to circulate not just among the oppressed, but among those who had once believed that submission was the only way to survive. Yet, no one dared speak up. No one dared move. The Empire was too powerful, too entrenched. Those who resisted were made examples of, like the 60,000 in front of the cameras. The high officials in their gleaming uniforms, the soldiers standing guard at every exit, and the silent, faceless forces that upheld the Empire's reign made sure of that. A ripple of tension ran through the air, as the gallows were lowered into place. The time had come. The prisoners were forced to kneel, their heads bowed in the grim, unavoidable understanding of what was about to happen. Some whispered their final goodbyes to one another, while others simply stared ahead, resolute in their silence. But then, unexpectedly, a message cut through the Empire's meticulously choreographed broadcast, a transmission so out of place, so jarring, that it stunned the viewers into silence. The Imperial officials stiffened. Their eyes darted to their control consoles, but the source was already identified: human diplomat Alec Larkin. He had somehow hacked into the broadcast. The Empire had not anticipated this intrusion. The message he sent was not one of defiance or rebellion, it was a call for justice, calm but insistent, to the highest reaches of the Empire's leadership. Larkin demanded that the execution cease immediately and that the rebels be given a fair trial. He invoked the laws of the Interstellar Coalition, to which the Empire had agreed in principle, and reminded them that the execution of political prisoners without trial was not only a violation of galactic law but a violation of their own code of conduct. For a moment, there was silence. The Imperial officials were caught off guard, unsure how to proceed. This was a diplomatic matter, not a military one. They had anticipated everything but this. The arrogance with which they had planned the mass execution now began to fray at the edges, as they realized that they had underestimated not just the humans' willingness to intervene but their ability to do so with such a precise, calculating approach. The message went viral almost immediately, spreading across the galaxy faster than the Empire's own broadcast could. Alec Larkin had been careful to ensure that his transmission reached not just the leadership of the Empire but also the people watching the execution. Millions, perhaps billions, were now aware of what was happening. And suddenly, the once certain dominance of the Empire began to feel a little less absolute. In the crowded streets of galactic capitals, in the small, quiet sectors that lay far from the Empire's center, people began to question what they had long accepted as inevitable. The rebels, previously seen as nothing more than traitors, were now viewed through a new lens. The Empire's brutal display was not an assertion of strength, it was an admission of weakness. The Empire had tried to crush a spark of rebellion through sheer violence, but in doing so, it had lit a fire of outrage among the very citizens it sought to control. But Alec Larkin's message was not just a plea for mercy, it was a statement of humanity's place in the galaxy. The Empire, despite its immense power, had failed to predict one simple truth: humans were unpredictable. They did not play by the rules, and that made them dangerous in a way the Empire had never truly understood. The rebellion that had been extinguished in a single broadcast was now alive again, and this time, it was not just the oppressed who would rise. The call for justice had been answered, and the Empire's display of power had inadvertently sparked something far more powerful: hope. The crowd watching across the galaxy was vast, millions of eyes glued to their screens as the countdown began. The announcer's voice boomed in every corner of the Empire, his words dripping with a mix of authority and disdain. He spoke of justice, of order being restored, of the gallant Empire standing as the unshakable pillar of peace in a chaotic universe. Each word was calculated, meant to rattle the nerves of any potential rebel. But to those who had been captured, it was nothing but the prelude to death. The rebels stood silent, but there was strength in their silence. Their eyes, though locked on the towering scaffold ahead of them, betrayed no fear. They were resigned, not to the inevitability of their deaths, but to the hope that their sacrifice would ignite something larger, something that the Empire couldn't crush as easily as they crushed individuals. They had known what was coming when they first took up arms. They had known the Empire's cruelty, its swift and brutal means of control. But they also knew that humanity, and those who joined them, fought for something more than mere survival. They fought for freedom. And that, no matter how the Empire twisted it, could not be erased from the universe. But it wasn't just the prisoners who had prepared for this moment. Ambassador Alec Larkin, standing in the midst of the diplomatic chamber aboard his ship, clenched his fists as the broadcast flared to life across his screen. He had seen these kinds of events before, knew the Empire's tactics, but this was different. This wasn't just a massacre, it was a statement. The Empire had crossed a line. And Larkin would make sure they paid for it. Larkin had been sent by the Interstellar Coalition to monitor the treatment of prisoners under the Empire's reign, to ensure the human colonies were treated fairly in the expanding Galactic Empire. But this act, this public execution, went far beyond anything the Coalition had anticipated. There were humans in those ranks, and Larkin knew that their deaths would resonate throughout the human colonies. This wasn't just about diplomacy anymore. This was personal. He didn't hesitate. Picking up the comm device, he opened a secure channel to the Empire's Central Command. The lines buzzed with static, but Larkin's calm voice cut through it all, sending a shockwave of clarity through the room. "I'm Ambassador Alec Larkin of the Interstellar Coalition," he began. "And I demand to speak to your leader. Now." His words were sharp, purposeful. The Empire was used to dealing with politicians, with subservient negotiators, with those who knew their place in the hierarchy of galactic politics. Larkin, however, was no such diplomat. His reputation preceded him. He wasn't afraid to burn bridges, not if it meant righting a wrong. And this was a wrong that demanded justice. The transmission flickered before an Imperial officer appeared on the screen. His face was cold, disinterested, clearly someone who had seen his fair share of conflict. But when his eyes locked with Larkin's, something in his posture shifted. Larkin didn't smile. He didn't need to. "I'm watching your broadcast," Larkin said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable weight. "And I don't care what the so-called rebels did or didn't do. What you're doing right now goes against every principle that the galaxy, that civilization stands for. You're not executing criminals. You're murdering innocent people. And that won't stand. The officer blinked, his mouth opening slightly in disbelief. You dare. I dare, Larkin interrupted, his voice gaining strength. What's happening right now is a violation of galactic law. I'm not here to play games. This is not just about the lives you're extinguishing. It's about the message you're sending, that anyone who defies you, no matter the cause, will be wiped out. That's not justice. That's tyranny. The officer's face twisted into something like amusement, but it was clear that Larkin's words had hit a nerve. The Empire had never encountered someone quite like him, someone who wasn't afraid to confront their power, even in their own home. Your people's opinions are meaningless, Ambassador. This is a show of strength. You, the officer sneered, are in no position to dictate terms. Larkin's eyes narrowed. You're wrong. The people of the galaxy won't stand for this. You think you've crushed rebellion by hanging these innocents, but you've just lit a fire that will burn across every star system you hold. You can't silence 60,000 voices with violence. The officer's lips twitched, a faint line of tension appearing at the corners of his mouth. It was the first crack in his otherwise impenetrable demeanor. Your people are just humans. You're no match for the Empire. Larkin leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity. Don't underestimate us. Humans don't need to match your power. We don't need to be bigger, or stronger, or more ruthless. What we have is far more dangerous. We know how to fight when the odds are stacked against us. And we will not sit quietly while you murder innocent lives. The officer shifted uncomfortably but quickly regained his composure. You have no authority here, Ambassador. Your coalition is weak. You'll watch this unfold like everyone else. Larkin's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, one that carried an edge of finality. You're wrong. The people you hang today will be remembered as martyrs. And they will inspire 100 rebellions. 1,000. The galaxy won't forget what you've done. The officer's eyes flickered for a moment, an unease threading through his stance. You think you can change this? You're one man. Larkin didn't flinch. And one man is all it takes. The call ended abruptly, and Larkin sat back, his thoughts focused. He had no illusions about stopping the executions. But what he had done was plant a seed of doubt in the Empire's mind. They had just made a grave mistake, and no amount of Imperial bluster would erase the truth. The galaxy had witnessed the cruelty. And now, the fight for justice would begin. The Empire had just made its first mistake. It had underestimated humanity. The broadcast continued, its grim purpose unbroken, but the atmosphere had shifted. Across the galaxy, the murmurs of discontent grew louder. People tuned in not to see the rebels executed, but to hear more from the human diplomat who had dared to challenge the Empire in real time. The Imperial officers were scrambling behind the scenes, desperate to regain control of the narrative. But Alec Larkin was far from finished. His next move was subtle, calculated. He wasn't content with just interrupting their display of power, he wanted to dismantle it piece by piece, right in front of their audience. With a calm precision that belied the stakes, Alec tapped into his neural interface, patching his voice into the Empire's live feed once again. I hope you're all watching closely, Alec's voice echoed across the broadcast. This is what happens when power goes unchecked. 60,000 lives, each one with dreams, families, futures, are about to be erased. Not because they're guilty of some heinous crime, but because they dared to stand up to oppression. This isn't strength. This is fear, wrapped in the illusion of authority. The words struck a nerve. Across the galaxy, viewers sat up, their attention sharpening. Alec's tone wasn't accusatory, it was measured, almost conversational. Yet every sentence carried an undercurrent of quiet rage, a simmering defiance that refused to be ignored. In the Empire's control room, the officials were growing increasingly restless. Their leader, an imposing figure with a face like carved stone, glared at the display. Shut him down, he barked at the technicians. But it wasn't that simple. Alec had planned for this. His signal was bouncing between thousands of relays, impossible to trace in real time. Every second he remained on air was another second the Empire's grip on the narrative slipped. You claim to be protectors of order, Alec continued, his voice steady. But tell me, what kind of order thrives on the corpses of the innocent? What kind of peace is built on fear? If your empire is so strong, why do you need to silence those who question it? The audience didn't need to answer. The truth was already there, unspoken but undeniable. The rebels weren't terrorists, they were victims. The Empire's mask of legitimacy was cracking, and Alec was driving the wedge deeper. Behind the scenes, Alec's team was hard at work. His advisors, a motley crew of human specialists and a few trusted alien allies, were executing a coordinated operation. Data leaks, communications disruptions, and subtle sabotage were all part of the plan. The Empire had thought itself invulnerable, but Alec knew better. Every system had weaknesses, and humans had a knack for finding them. The first cracks appeared in the broadcast itself. The Empire's carefully curated feed, meant to show the rebels as faceless enemies, began to glitch. Images of the prisoners shifted, replaced by snapshots of their lives before their capture. A mother holding her child. A young man repairing a broken starship. A group of friends laughing over a shared meal. Each image was a reminder, these were people, not numbers. The Empire's leader slammed his fist against the console, his voice a growl of frustration. Find the source. Shut it down. But the damage was done. The rebels were no longer a nameless, faceless mass. They were individuals, each one a story, a life worth saving. And Alec had made sure the galaxy would remember them. What you're witnessing, Alec said, his voice cutting through the chaos, is the true face of the Empire. They'll tell you this is justice, but it's nothing more than a spectacle. A way to keep you afraid, to keep you obedient. But ask yourselves, what happens when the rebels are gone? Who will be next? The question lingered, heavy with implication. Alec didn't need to spell it out. The Empire's citizens weren't blind. They had seen neighbors disappear, friends accused of crimes they didn't commit. The execution of the rebels was just the beginning, and Alec's words were a reminder that no one was truly safe. But Alec wasn't content with words alone. He knew that rhetoric, no matter how powerful, wouldn't be enough. He needed action. And that's where his team came in. On a distant moon, hidden within the shadow of a gas giant, a covert human outpost was coming to life. Alec had called in favors, pulling together resources that had taken years to accumulate. This wasn't just about saving lives, it was about sending a message. The Empire wasn't untouchable. As Alec spoke, his team executed their final move. A carefully timed power surge rippled through the Empire's network, causing screens across the galaxy to flicker. For a moment, the Empire's broadcast was replaced entirely by Alec's feed. His face filled the screens, his gaze steady and unyielding. To the people of the galaxy, Alec said, you have a choice. You can let this happen, let fear dictate your lives. Or you can stand up. Not just for the rebels, but for yourselves. The Empire wants you to believe you're powerless. But together, you're unstoppable. The feed cut abruptly, returning to the Empire's broadcast. But the damage was done. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and Alec knew they would grow. The Empire could hang its prisoners, could try to erase their stories, but the galaxy had already seen the truth. And once the truth was out, it was impossible to bury. In the control room, the Empire's leader seethed with rage. This isn't over, he hissed, his fists clenched. But even he knew the tide was turning. The rebels weren't the only ones fighting now. Across the galaxy, ordinary citizens were beginning to question the authority they had once feared. And Alec Larkin, the human diplomat, had become the spark that lit the flame. As the broadcast continued, Alec leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He had bought the rebels time, but the fight was far from over. The Empire would retaliate, of that he was certain. But for now, he had given the galaxy something it hadn't had in a long time: hope. And that was more powerful than any weapon. The Empire's control over the broadcast was slipping. Alec had anticipated their reaction, and his voice now resonated across not just the Empire's channels but also the wider Galactic network. The officials had failed to shut him down, and with every second that passed, his influence grew stronger. The broadcast, once a demonstration of absolute dominance, had become a platform for defiance. And as the rebels stood at the edge of death, Alec's words began to reverberate in the hearts of countless listeners across the galaxy. "It's no surprise," Alec continued, his voice cool but filled with undeniable conviction, "that a regime which thrives on fear would choose this, public executions, to maintain its hold. The rebels you are about to kill are not criminals. They are the brave few who dared to believe in something bigger than themselves, the idea that the Empire is not eternal, that tyranny can be toppled, that hope is not dead." The Imperial officers fumbled with their consoles. They had never expected a human diplomat to cause such an uproar. But what they didn't understand was that Alec Larkin wasn't here to negotiate. He wasn't here to ask for leniency or demand clemency for these so-called criminals. He was here to dismantle their facade of power, to expose the Empire's true nature, and to ignite something far greater than this broadcast could ever contain. The rebels, despite their shackles, stood straighter now. There was an undeniable shift in their collective spirit. Alec's words weren't just a plea for mercy, they were a rallying cry. The rebels, each of them, might be facing death, but they knew now that the galaxy was watching, and they were not alone. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something larger. The Empire's high-ranking officials, now realizing the enormity of their blunder, grew frantic. They ordered everything shut down, immediately. But the damage was done. The rebels stood defiant, their fates sealed but their spirits far from broken. As the news tightened, Alec's voice broke through the final moments, cutting through the Empire's frantic commands. "Remember this, Empire," Alec said, his voice unwavering. "In your hunger to extinguish hope, you've only sparked the flames of rebellion. The galaxy will not forget what you've done here today. And we, the free peoples of this galaxy, will rise." The broadcast cut abruptly. The executions went ahead, but the world had changed. The images of those 60,000 bodies hung in the air, but so did Alec's message, a promise of justice, of resistance, and of humanity's unbreakable will to fight for freedom. Across the galaxy, a spark had been lit. And in the wake of that spark, the Empire's grip began to loosen. The 60,000 may have fallen, but their deaths had not been in vain. The rebellion was not over, it had only just begun.